Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel where today we are going to do my February mid-month wrap-up. So I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in the first 2 weeks of February. And you guys, already this month has been very strange. So story time. So generally speaking, I set my TBR for the next month about a week ahead of time. So a week before that month starts. That gives me enough time to film my TBR and like get all the books from the library, everything, right? It works really well for me. Well, I decided in February that I was going to read 3 tomes. It was going to be books 3 and 4 in the Throne of Glass series, and then the second book in the Expanse series. And so I set the rest of my TBR around that. I chose short things, I chose easy to read things, sometimes both. It was going to be great. And then I filmed this video and I posted it, and almost immediately things started going a little weird. So in January, I was reading book 2 of the Throne of Glass series, and then I DNF'd book 2 of the Throne of Glass series. So I was like, well, I'm not going to read book 3 and 4, so there's 2 books off my list, two tomes off of my TBR list. And then one of the books that I was going to read was a buddy read with Julie over at Julie H. We were going to buddy read Heartless by Marissa Mayer. And on January 31st, I was like, I don't like this. And I DNF'd that one as well. And then at the same time, I was also reading a book called Club Monstrosity by Jessie Peterson. And I finished that ahead of time. So come Feb 1, I had gone from 11 books on my TBR down to 7. And the month had just barely started, right? And then the other thing that I didn't realize was I had put the Caliban's War, which is the second book in the Expanse series by James S. A. Corey. I had put that on hold at my library, and it should have been fine because everybody's due dates were coming up. Nobody has brought back their copy to the library, so I'm still waiting. It shouldn't have been a problem for me to get it in February, but I'm still waiting, so I don't know when I'm going to be able to read that one as well. So, like, all of my tomes on this TBR, like, just I couldn't read, or I wasn't going to read. So I ended up with like 6 books, and they were mostly all short and very easy to read. So then like I just had to pick random stuff, and actually it's gone really well. And so I've mostly focused on reading some short things or things that I thought I was going to DNF. So far I've read 5 different things that are like novels, novellas. I've read 7 different volumes in this manga series, and then I also DNF'd 5 different things. Now, I know that this is a really long intro, but the DNF'd books I am not going to talk about in this video. I'm actually going to talk about them at the end of February. Like, I'll just collect all of February's DNFs and talk about it in one video later on. But we're just going to jump in with the things that I did end up reading. So, the very first thing that I read was The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This is a novella, and we're following this man as he ends up in his hometown for a funeral. So he goes and visits like his old house, but his old house has been demolished, so he continues on down the lane to the farmhouse where one of his friends lived. And so he ends up there, and they kindly let him like sit on this bench to stare at this pond, and he ends up reminiscing about his time with this girl. And the story goes from there. And this is very strange to me because I fully recognize how good this book is and how many people would love this book, and I felt absolutely no connection to it whatsoever. So it was just kind of a weird thing where it's like the writing was good, but not a style that I generally prefer. The characters were well written, but I didn't care about either of them. Like, I thought that some of the things going on were interesting, but we never got full explanations, which just kind of ended up bothering me. It's set in the past where, when he was a boy, which is, I think like maybe 60s or 70s, which is a time period I don't like reading historical fiction from like the 60s or 70s. So basically, like, I recognize how well written it was. It just, like, none of it worked for me. And it was weird because, like, because it was so well written, I found it compelling. I wanted to keep reading. But when I actually sat and thought about this book, I was like, I don't actually like it all that much. I don't dislike it. It's just so badly not for me that I don't have any real feelings about it. And so it was very strange. I ended up rating it 3.75 because I really so badly just did not connect with this book in any way. So I didn't really want to give it a very high rating. But I also recognize that it is very well written. And so, like, I didn't want to give it a particularly low rating either. So I settled on a 3.75. After that, I read Imaginary Numbers by Seanan McGuire, which is the 9th book in the Encrypted series. And so this is an adult urban fantasy series that follows a family of cryptozoologists, and they basically study and liaison with and sometimes kill the monsters that we don't even know exists in this world. Each story, like, in this particular series, we actually also shift narrators occasionally. And in this book, we have shifted over to a cousin, Sarah. And Sarah is not human. She's basically a cuckoo, which is similar enough to a wasp, but she's basically got a human body. And she's got some interesting telepathic powers, but she's always kind of known that, like, it's going to come to a head because cuckoos generally don't play well with humans. And so, like, she doesn't necessarily like the rest of her species, but also, like, the rest of her species doesn't necessarily like the rest of Sarah's family. And so, in this particular one, the other cuckoos want her to do something, and they don't really care about the cost to Sarah. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying really hard not to spoil anything for, like, any of the previous books either. It's difficult. But I ended up really liking this. I liked Annie as, like, the last narrator. I like the last narrator better than the previous ones, but I found that I connected even better with Sarah. She is just very, I don't know, I just really liked her. She does have a lot of anxiety things going on, but, like, I can't really complain because I've got a lot of anxiety things going on too, so at least I understand it. I thought that the story itself was interesting. However, I do find occasionally that with this series, I read it and then I'm like, yeah, of course that's what happens. Of course. And I have to kind of suspend disbelief to some extent, which I don't love. And I did have to do that with this book. But I liked that everything kind of, like, if you can accept it, everything logically follows from that. And I do like that. I like that, just generally, I liked that we got to see Sarah's cousins from a different perspective, like, obviously her perspective, but it's different than what we've had before. I really appreciated that. And I liked this book. However, I'm finding that this series is not my favorite series. It's good and it's enjoyable, and I always have a good time reading it, but I don't, like, to borrow a phrase from Sam over at Thoughts on Tomes, this series doesn't sit in my feelings. Like, it just doesn't have that extra oomph. And I think part of it is because I don't think we have this I don't think we're resolving towards any kind of overarching storyline. It's just like these, like, individual books have kind of a storyline. So this one and the next one, the previous 3 were a storyline, but nothing that's connecting all of them. And that's kind of been bothering me a little bit. But generally speaking, this is well written and I did enjoy it. So I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I read Across the Green Grass Fields by Seanan McGuire. This is the 6th book in the Wayward Children series, which is a portal fantasy series of novellas, and we are following the kids at Eleanor West's home for wayward children. And essentially, all of the kids at this home have they all found a door when they were younger, and they went through it, and they found themselves in a completely different world where they had adventures, and eventually got kicked back to our world, and they're just not adjusting well. In this series, all of the even numbered books, we follow one of the students in their past as they go through their doorway. So in this particular one, we are following Reagan, and Reagan is, when we meet her, is 10 years old, and she thinks life is fine. She's 10, it's fine. But her parents sit her down and let her know that she is actually intersex, and like what that means for her and what that means for her future. And that's kind of a lot to take in. And as she's walking along her creek, she finds a doorway, she walks through it, and there she is in the Hooflands. And in the Hooflands, it's basically everything that we think of as mythical creatures that have hoofs. They're there. And they are very excited to see Reagan because they know that it actually means that something bad is on its way, but that also means that Reagan is going to be their savior. And the story goes from there. I do already have a full-length review for this book, so I will leave it linked down below and keep this relatively short, but I loved this book. So the world building I thought was really well done. It felt like a small slice of this larger, real world. And I thought that was really well done. I thought Reagan was a very good depiction of a 10-year-old, like realistic depiction of a 10-year-old. And I honestly loved, one of the things that I loved about this book is that Reagan got to grow up away from the societal pressures, because if she had grown up in our society, there just would have been so much pressure on her to do puberty as everybody else is, and she was never going to. And so I like that she got to just be herself, and nobody commented on it. They're like, oh, apparently that's what's normal. And so I really loved that for her, and I really liked the ending. So I ended up giving this 5 stars. After that, I read The AI Who Loved Me by Alyssa Cole, and this is a romance novella. And this is basically, we're following our main character of Trinity, and she lives in this apartment complex. And one day she meets a neighbor, Li Wei, and she's just like, she has multiple thoughts about him. One of them being that she feels a connection with him, the other being that he's really weird. And she's not wrong, because it turns out Li Wei is an AI. And it's a romance, so everything kind of goes from there. And this was actually originally written to be an audiobook. Like, that's how, like, it was intended to be an audiobook, and then they just did an ebook afterwards. I did not listen to the audiobook because I really struggle to pay attention to audiobooks. They just don't really work for me. But I have heard that this is an excellent audiobook. So if that's what you're into, this is a good one to check out. But this book was so weird, and it was so perfectly weird for me. Like, the kind of weird that I really enjoy. First up, we have Li Wei, who is, like I said, an AI. He looks human, and he is learning how to blend in with humans. And I don't know what it is, but I have a soft spot for like AI who are trying really hard to understand humans, whether that's because they want to fit in or just because they need to understand. I love it so much. So that was like perfect. This is a science fiction story and it is pretty heavily science fiction, and I thought that science fiction storyline was great. Now, I will say that if you like science fiction but you don't really like romance, this might not work for you, because it's just like, the romance occasionally feels like it gets in the way. Like, for me, I was able to overlook it a little bit because I do like romance. But if you really don't, this may not work for you, even as good as the science fiction storyline is. And if you're really into romance, this also might not actually work as well for you. There's definitely like the insta love, insta lust. So if you're reading it for like that emotional connection, I don't think that that emotional connection was done particularly well. And if you're reading it for the smut, well, you guys, there's only one sex scene and it's not that steamy and it's over really quick. So like, yeah. For me, it worked just because I do like science fiction. I do like romance. I found it to be like not like I didn't find that the romance overwhelmed the story, the science fiction story, and it didn't bother me that this romance was there. Now I did dock at points for that insta love thing, even after having read the whole story. Like I was just like, I still didn't really appreciate that. Um, and I didn't love the ending. Like the ending didn't quite stick it for me. It's a good ending for the story. It just wasn't what I personally wanted. So like I think that it could have gone a slightly different way and would have been better. It was a little bit rushed was part of the problem. But overall, I kind of loved this story. I know that I'm being really pretty vague about a lot of this stuff, but I also can't really tell you too much about it because it gives it away as soon as you start talking about it. So it's really cool to watch this story unfold, and I do absolutely recommend it. And I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. And then after that, I read The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi, and this is a novella, and it's essentially that there is like the northern realms and there's like the southern realms, and the southern portion ended up like completely obliterating the northern. So the northern sent Inyo, who is a female, to marry the emperor of the south to become empress and kind of unite the lands. And Inyo ends up befriending one of her handmaidens, Rabbit, and plotting revenge. Now, this is also an interesting story because it is actually it's more of a story within a story. So our main characters are actually somebody by the name of Chi, who is a cleric who is essentially like they seek out to learn everything about everything. And then Rabbit, but much, much older. And so this is so interesting. Basically, it's got such an interesting format because, like, what ends up, Chi and Rabbit end up in this house together, and Chi is documenting the contents of the house, and Rabbit ends up telling stories about it, about those objects. So essentially, what you end up with is at the beginning of the chapter, there's like an inventory of a couple of items, and then we see a little scene with Chi and Rabbit, and where Chi asks about these objects or Rabbit notices them, and then Rabbit kind of launches into a story about it. And it's from the time that Rabbit and Inyo were living in this house together, like when she was in exile, when Inyo was in exile. And it pushes this overarching storyline of this revenge along. It's just so interestingly done, and like I found that to be immensely compelling how that was written. And it's just generally a novella that kind of unfolds in its own way, and like you're just along for the ride, and it worked really, really well. And obviously there's like that story within a story, and I just thought it was beautifully written and compellingly told. And bonus points because there was like a lot of just like background queer. It was just really awesome, and I loved it, and I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. And I want the next one in this series so badly. I want to read it. And then after that, the last thing I have to talk about is Library Wars, volumes 9 through 15. Obviously, so here's the deal, you guys. Okay, so I guess I should give a description. So, The Library Wars is a manga series, and basically it is set in the near future where Japan has passed a law that allows for censorship, and they created the Media Betterment Committee to enforce that censorship. the library immediately rebelled and created their own rules that basically said that they were allowed to like buy books for their collection as they saw fit, regardless of the censorship laws. And they also put together the library forces, which is a military force to defend the library. We are following our main character of Kasahara, and she is part of this defense force, and she is great. So volumes 9 through 15, this is like the end of the series. I finished this series. It's only 15 volumes long. It was so good. There was so much drama. There was so much angst. So there's like two basic stories that are constantly unfolding. And the big one is that Kasahara is in love, has the hots for her direct supervisor, Dojo. Like in the beginning, you can tell it's a thing, but nobody says anything about it. But they clearly like respect each other and everything, and they just don't know how to interact with each other in an adult kind of way. And so it's just really ridiculous. And the thing that saves it from being overly angsty and like just too tense for me is that everybody around them is just like completely understands what's going on. Like Dojo and Kasahara can't figure it out, can't seem to figure it out, but everybody else is just like, oh, they're fighting again? Of course they are. Because they're into each other. And so they're all in the background doing that kind of thing. And it just really, like, it relieves some of that tension and really makes it work. But the other thing is that in these volumes, you also get some really interesting storylines surrounding censorship. And like one of the things that is addressed in a kind of oblique sort of way at the end is the whole slippery slope of censorship. Like if you censor this one thing, then you're probably going to continue on and censor the next thing, and then the next, and then the next, until you've got the situation where you can't use certain words without getting censored, and like it doesn't even make sense. And then and I actually really loved the last arc that we had. I will say that if you are reading book 14 or volume 14, you should have volume 15 on hand because it ends on a cliffhanger. And then the other thing that I really, really appreciated is that Kasahara is frequently shown at being not good at clerical work, in that she makes a lot of silly little mistakes. And it's contrasted with her peer, Tezuka, who never makes those kinds of mistakes. He's like perfect at it. But I really, really appreciated that we frequently got to see Kasahara in her element too. So she's not great at the clerical work, but she's good with children, and we get to see her interacting with kids in the library. And we got to see that Tezuka doesn't do well with kids in those kinds of situations. So I really actually appreciated that we got to see all the characters as much more well-rounded than we frequently do in manga series. And so I really love this series so much, and I ended up giving all of these volumes between 4 and 5 stars. And that's it, you guys. That's what I read in the first 2 weeks. It was kind of a lot. I have no idea how the next 2 weeks are going to go. It might be just as chaotic. I don't know. We'll see. But that's it. So if you guys have read any of these, if you want to read any of these, you want to give me your thoughts and feelings about it, leave it for me down below. I would love to have a discussion with you about it. But that's all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.